I just saw Nosferatu and I want to talk about it. I am going to be doing a very spoilery review. I thought that it was a great movie. The cinematography, well, chef's kiss. What I love about the horror genre is that it's a great framework to look at the conscious and subconscious fears of a culture at any given time. Specifically, I want to talk about the 1922 movie's historical context. One of the first ever horror movies, why it was made, and some of the themes that are hypothesized that it could have been about, plot twists, a little bit of possible anti-Semitism conversation. So if that's a trigger warning for you, probably not the video for you. Also, just spoilers. Spoilers for Nosferatu. It's the same plot pretty much from the 1922 version of it and the 2024 version of it. So I guess spoilers for a 100-year-old movie, but you know, here we are. We're going to talk about what Robert Eggers chose to do with the movie, what he focused on. Without further ado, let's talk about the historical context of the 1922 Nosferatu. First of all, let's just back up and talk about Dracula. It's a story about a vampire, Count Dracula, who is trying to buy up land, and a real estate agent, Jonathan Harker, comes over, helps him sign the paperwork, and then, of course, chaos ensues, attacks the women, and then the heroes have to come in and kill the vampire, right? It was really playing on the historical fears of that time about like the aristocratic sort of elite taking over land, coming in, taking the women, right? So it was, here's the man who was gonna go and save the day, right? That's Dracula. The main change from Dracula over to Nosferatu was, one, it's set in Germany. Nosferatu is still coming over, buying up land in Germany, right? The Nina Harker female equivalent takes a stronger lead. So Nina Harker in the book Dracula, she gets seduced by Dracula, and then she's the victim, and then, you know, she's sort of like the woman that needs to get saved by the hero, right? And that's mainly the only part that she plays in that role, which really tells a story that, you know, whenever there's evil, let the guys take care of it. You know, it's kind of a good versus evil, very black and white at the end of the day story. But in Nosferatu, the Nina Harker equivalent, I think her name was Ellen, if I remember correctly, she plays a larger role in Nosferatu. The ending of Nosferatu is basically that she needs to allow Nosferatu to drink her blood until sunrise, until Nosferatu is killed by the sunlight. Sort of is like a martyr character. It's a more nuanced story in the fact that it's not like a yay, we win and everything's better. It's like, no, we do have to sacrifice deeply, even though it's worthwhile in this fight for good and evil. So the tone of the ending is different. Nosferatu ends on a tragic and somber note with Ellen's self-sacrifice leading to her death, versus Dracula has a much more uplifting kind of resolution of like good versus evil. Nosferatu places the burden almost entirely on Ellen, highlighting her individual sacrifice as the ultimate act of heroism. So let's tie that into post-World War I Germany. Post-World War I was a period marked by economic collapse, hyperinflation, and social instability. They were exhausted and just depleted of resources. It also was a period of time where the Nazi Party in Germany was starting to form. It was not quite in power. It was kind of its own little like political cult doing its own thing at that time. But as you can guess, that has some potential influence. Here comes Nosferatu, the movie. Count Orlok, which is the vampire in Nosferatu, represents a parasitic force that drains the vitality of individuals and communities, much like the economic hardships that Germany was enduring. Arrival of Nosferatu basically reflects this like fear of foreign control for the Germans. There was a fear of contagion and pandemic. Nosferatu basically is a symbol of that fear, as he brings the plague with him. The vampire spread of disease and death basically can be seen as a metaphor for the nation's perceived decay and inability to recover from the war. The other thing that's not talked about quite as much is the possible anti-Semitic tones, undertones of Nosferatu. There's a long historic anti-Semitic story that is basically about the like rich Jew coming in and stealing up land, and they're gonna steal your women and like all that, all that like terrible stuff. You can look at the character of Nosferatu as a stand-in for that. You can also look at how Nosferatu, the character design, looks like a humanoid rat person. Like the two fangs, they're much more like rat-like in the middle. Character walks around with like rat-like claws. The stereotypes that Nosferatu exhibit basically look like some of the like Nazi propaganda that were coming up around that time, and brings a literal plague of rats to Germany. So if you're putting the pieces together, the story is a rich foreigner comes in, brings the plague, is dirty, is stealing the women, right? Like this is very common fascist rhetoric. We look at the Nazi Party. What historically fascists do is they create an other that is strong and also weak at the same time, right? Nosferatu is strong and evil, but not too strong. We can still overcome this like other. So we've talked about sort of the historical context. We've talked about the anti-Semitic context of it as well. I want to talk about Robert Eggers' decisions that he made in remaking the movie Nosferatu. First of all, I feel like it's hard to be a lover of Nosferatu to the level that he says he is, that he's always dreamed since teenage years to remake Nosferatu without knowing the historical context of it. But I also don't feel like he did much to take out any of the potential anti-Semitic undertones, so that's also kind of a thing. Listening to some interviews, he really talks about the way that he wanted to tell the story was a bigger focus on like the heroine, the character Ellen, and her battle against Nosferatu. I think he really achieved that. I think if you look at it from a perspective of this heroine character, fighting against evil, and in some ways like really relating to evil. I think it's interesting like looking at his movie The Witch. We will call it The Witch, like that's obviously the correct way to pronounce it. The Witch is also a story of like this female character grasping with her relationship with like this darker side, and spoilers for The Witch, basically that character ends up becoming a witch after her whole family is dead and she joins a coven. Is sort of like how we're left to believe the end of that story. And in the same way with 2024 Nosferatu, Ellen has always had these essentially like psychic powers. Like she basically was able to connect with Nosferatu in a sort of like spiritual psychic way, and that was what was bringing Nosferatu to Germany, was because he was so attracted to this woman. But in order for her to defeat Nosferatu, she needs to embrace her shadow side, she needs to embrace her sexuality and literally sacrifice herself through an act of sex, which is wild and was so gross. And also like what's his face who played Nosferatu, oh my god, I didn't even realize, I forgot that he was in the movie. Let me look it up. Bill Skarsgård. Holy lord, that man disappeared into the role. I completely forgot he was in the movie. Also shout out to, just as a quick tangent, shout out to Willem Dafoe, my man. I loved him playing his like Van Helsing equivalent. But I think going back to my point, it was definitely focused more on the story of the feminine hero as opposed to the historical context. I think it's important to look at stories like this because, again, like I freaking love horror because it's a way for us to analyze our fears, what the culture is thinking about at any given time. That's why I like stream video games that are horror games. I think it's really cool to see like what are like indie creators telling, what are the larger stories. I think some of the best storytelling is happening on video games as well. But whenever there's a good movie out, I gotta talk about it. So yeah, so curious to know what you think about it, if you agree, if you disagree, if you think it did a good job in grappling with the themes of the original movie or grappling with the themes that it decided to focus on. That's my ramble about Nosferatu. Thanks for listening.